would first like to say a few general introductory words about propaganda, and then proceed to discuss Karel's book and in which way his book perhaps makes us see Soviet propaganda in a new light in some respects. Well, as I see it, the general context of this book is the insight that even bloody dictatorships like Stalin's are not and can never be exclusively based on terror. This is a kind of Darwinian mechanism. Regimes that are purely based on terror will not survive for very long. They will very soon disappear. What is necessary is, in addition to terror, is in the first place that at least a substantial part of the population thinks a regime is legitimate in the Weberian sense. A substantial part of the regime must accept, of the population must accept the regime. And secondly, there must be a degree of active participation of the populace in the state. This is important for the states, for a lot of efforts by the state, such as production, war, and in this case war is very important. And this goes, this kind of active participation, especially in the political sense, is at least as important for totalitarian regimes as for other forms of dictatorship. And this is where propaganda comes in. This is not only my analysis. Were Stalin present here, he would wholeheartedly agree with what I have just said, because he was not a stupid guy at all. There is, I think, in the Bolshevik context, there is an extra dimension to this problem. The Bolsheviks were always very much aware of the fact that they represented a rather limited section of the population, that theirs was a minority dictatorship. Stalin didn't want to use the word party dictatorship, Lenin did, but Stalin didn't find that very tactful, so he avoided that. But he, of course, understood that this was a party dictatorship. And the Bolsheviks always understood that they were permanently in danger. Outwardly, this regime looked very secure, but these were, and it looked very powerful, but these were in fact frightened people. If we read debates in 1936 about, there was a kind of idea of experimenting with a little more, a little wider, more wide form of elections, and there was immediately great fear among the regional party leaders. What will this lead to? I mean, this will lead to all kinds of expressions of opinion which are dangerous for us. There was also in the Bolshevik regime, many of the Bolsheviks have experienced the October Revolution as nothing less but a miracle. When they, in early 1917, there were 20,000 Bolsheviks, and half a year later they were in power. They couldn't believe what had happened. And this is also why they saw Lenin as a kind of miracle man, but they never stopped being afraid. And they had to make every effort to make the population believe and to look at the world through their eyes and see the population, see the world as they saw it. Also, Stalin's paranoia contributed greatly to this, because he saw enemies even where there were no enemies. I mean, there were a lot of enemies, but he saw many more enemies than there really were. And this, of course, contributed to the need, as he felt it, for a secure propaganda effort I mean, apart from terror, this was absolutely necessary to uphold the state. I think there are several traditional ways of looking at Soviet propaganda during the war, a number of more or less fixed views that we have had for decades. One of these views, I think you can distinguish four such points. One of the points is that during the Second World War, Russian nationalism became much stronger, became much more powerful, and the reason for that is that, or supposedly is that the Soviet citizens were not prepared to fight for the socialist system, so they had to be offered something else to fight, which is Russian nationalism was a good stand-in for the socialist system. It fits in this image. We all know that Stalin's first speech, after the beginning of the war, he addressed the other citizens like brothers and sisters, not like comrades, and so on. Secondly, we know from the work mainly of David Brandenburger that in some respects this transition already existed before the Second World War. This was not started in the Second World War. In the books, he has written several books now on this issue. Brandenburger explains that the social propaganda in the abstract is not effective, and to mobilize the people, something else was needed, and two lines were propounded. First was heroism. I mean, heroes are people you can easily identify with. It gives the state a face. So there were heroes, military heroes, but also people in sports, pilots, and Stalin himself, of course, who was the greatest hero of all, the sun among the stars. And secondly, patriotism. So patriotism in the 30s, even before the war, the Soviet patriotism became a strong factor. The third traditional view is that during the Second World War, the controls became less strict. There was something of a thaw, supposedly a political cultural thaw, which was also necessary in this line of argument because otherwise the people wouldn't have fought. And also because of the chaos of the war, the controls simply couldn't be upheld in the same way as before the war. Fourthly, the increase of anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union, the establishment of anti-Semitism as a state policy has often been pinpointed during the war, and this could be seen as part of the phenomenon of Russian nationalism. So anti-Semitism and Russian nationalism in a way go together. I think Karel's book corrects these interpretations in some way and relativizes their significance in some way, and I would like to mention a few of these points. Well, first of all, the interesting thing is that it appears that, in fact, Russian nationalism, in the strict sense, did not increase during the war, but rather decreased somewhat in significance during in the propaganda. You must make a very important distinction between Soviet patriotism, which is the patriotism of the Soviet state, and Russian nationalism in the strict sense, which would mean the propaganda for the leading role of the Russians and the efforts of the Russian people in the sense of the part of the whole Soviet state. This Russian nationalism, the significance of this actually decreased somewhat during the war. Secondly, that's the whole question of anti-Semitism. Karel has shown in this Kritika article, and it's repeated in the book, that the idea which we have had that the Holocaust was totally buried and not talked about at all, and also the lecture we just had, this was also shown, that this is not true, it's somewhat exaggerated. And this, I think, is an important new insight we now have. On the other hand, of course, anti-Semitism in the sense of more or less burying the Holocaust, to a certain extent, it did remain. Why was this so? Karel has a he explains this partly from you might say a kind of cynical factor. The argument, which, if I understood it properly, his argument is this: among the Soviet population, anti-Semitism was a strong factor. This was Stalin's argument. If we give a central place, a central significance to Jewish suffering, this will not help our mobilizing effort, because non-Jewish Soviet people will not find this very important, and this will divert from our real effort. Perhaps this was so. I don't know that. It's possible, but I think I would suggest another point, which to me seems rather obvious. There is a certain parallel, as I see it, between the fact that Russian nationalism was de-emphasized during the war and the fact that and the anti-Semitism which was there. It means both that there was less emphasis, less attention for the leading role of the Russians, and there was also less attention for the Jewish suffering in the war. Karel says a lot about, I sometimes need to always stand up. I even start to talk about Jesus when I want to speak about Stalin. Very strange in my head. There was an ethnization of the image of the Germans. The Germans, all Germans were killers, all Germans were monsters. I think Karel brings this out very strongly in the book, but there was another issue which is, I must say, a little bit at odds with what I've just said about treating all people in the same way. But during the war, I think there was also a powerful Slavic factor, not the Russians specifically, but the Slavs, and Stalin presented the war as an effort of the Slavs against the Germans, and the Slavic races against the Germanic races, the Slavic races against the non-Slavic races. And this is an aspect, of course, I did not, like Karel, read through all these newspapers of this period, but I think this may be another important issue, may have been another important issue in this propaganda war. Another point I find interesting in the book is that it's not completely true that there was no propaganda for the Soviet system, in the socialist system. It was there, and it didn't completely disappear. Also, the theme which has already been discussed about the so-called weakening of controls, that Karel says this is not true. The weakening of controls wasn't there. I must say that this was also argued in an earlier book by Katerina Clark and Yevgeny Dobrenko, Soviet Culture and Power, which says the same thing, and it's also based on research of press materials. Now I come to this point of control and the question of the effectivity of effectiveness of propaganda. Karel says that there's a kind of, and I find this interesting, there's a kind of, I would almost say, a kind of dialectic between the aspiration for control and mobilization, which is, both of them are, of course, important for the Soviet authorities, were important for them. These two purposes can be at odds to a certain extent. It is shown in the book that Stalin had this cult of secrecy. I must say, just as an aside, that this idea, it comes from the Russian term is conspiratia, and this was because communist parties, that's the origin, communist parties begin as illegal parties, underground parties, and they do not manage to understand that once they are in power, they are no longer in the underground, so they go on and on. And as an underground party, there are some examples. For instance, the Yugoslav party and Pol Pot, when he came to power in Cambodia, nobody knew in Cambodia. In Yugoslavia they knew it, but they didn't say it. But in Cambodia they didn't even know that the Communist Party was in power for 2 years. It was also only called ANCAR, the organization. And it were the Chinese who told Pol Pot, you cannot go on with this, you have to tell these people that you are a communist. But this is just an aside. There was a cult of secrecy, but this meant that there was very little information in the press. Also, Stalin was very fearful. He did not want negative information in the press. There should be no reports of weaknesses. The problem is, Karel says, this harms mobilization. I mean, if you cannot discuss weakness, you cannot address this problem. If you are not informative, your propaganda is very sterile and it's not lively, and people will not move for you. On the other hand, I think perhaps, I'm not sure whether you do not a bit overly exaggerate this contrast. I mean, in Stalin's time, control was not a purpose in itself. One of the purposes of control was mobilization. And I don't know whether I would counterpose these two elements so into such a degree. I'm thinking of another example which is in the same line. If you look at the science policies of Stalinism, you have the same kind of dilemma. Science, as in any state, I must say, but science in the Stalinist state had a dual function. On the one hand, it provided legitimacy for the state. I mean, the state could say we have a particular system which is very favorable for science, and also science proves that we are right. That's so modern science shows that communism is correct, basically. On the other hand, science was also a productive factor. I mean, it was supposed to work. Science must work. So, for instance, if we have the notorious Lysenko, the biologist, Stalin wanted biology to serve as a legitimation of the Soviet state. That's why he chose Lysenko as the number one in biology. On the other hand, what Lysenko had to say was just a lot of nonsense. So it was very bad for Soviet agriculture. So Stalin had to create some kind of balance. Another example is quantum mechanics, modern physics. There was the idea of having a campaign against quantum mechanics as a bourgeois science. And then Kurchatov, the number one scientist for the nuclear bomb, said, well, all right, you can do that, but if we cannot use quantum mechanics, there will be no bomb. And predictably, Stalin and Beria decided to have the bomb rather than a campaign against bourgeois science. So I think there is always this factor of realism, and the idea of total control is perhaps a bit too much. Finally, about effectiveness, and that will be my last point. I think I agree that this propaganda was not very effective. Very often, sometimes it was, but sometimes it was not. So why did these people fight? Why did the Soviet people fight? I've just read the book, Ian Kershaw's book, about the last year of the German Empire, and he has, of course, a lot of conclusions, but one of his conclusions was that the ordinary Germans had the idea that we have no alternative, because on one hand we have this marauding and raping Soviet army, on the other hand we have this terrorist bombing campaigns by the Americans and the English, turning our cities into rubble. So we must, in order to survive, we must fight on. This was not a Nazi sympathy necessarily of the ordinary population, but they had the idea we have no alternative. I think the same, I think Karel will probably agree, the same was the case in Soviet Russia, because the Nazis didn't give people an alternative. The Nazi occupation was too bad to be considered as an alternative. And in that sense, the propaganda from whatever effort was really irrelevant. Which is not to say that I find Karel's book irrelevant, of course.